The silver tray was a dead weight in my hands, a perfect, polished circle of silence. In the dining room of Ryo Tanaka, silence was a currency, and he was the only one wealthy enough to spend it. The air was thick with the scent of seared wagyu, expensive whiskey, and unspoken threats. My job was to be invisible, a ghost in a crisp black uniform, refilling glasses and clearing plates without a sound. It was a skill I had perfected. I could move through a room full of predators and leave no trace, no ripple in the tense atmosphere. It was how I survived. Tonight, the tension was a coiled snake. Ryo sat at the head of the long, black-lacquered table, a king on a throne of minimalist Japanese design. He wasn't large, but his stillness commanded more space than any of the brawny, tattooed men who flanked him. I learned more from watching his hands than from anything else. Tonight, they were resting on the table, one on either side of his plate. The left hand was bare, elegant, the knuckles slightly scarred. The right, however, was where the story was. A platinum watch, understated and worth more than my life, was strapped to his wrist, the band resting against the intricate blue-black scales of a dragon tattoo that snaked up his forearm and disappeared under the cuff of his bespoke charcoal suit. He moved that hand now, a slow, deliberate gesture to pick up his glass, and the room held its breath. He was speaking to a lieutenant, a man named Endo whose sweat was beading on his upper lip despite the room's chill. Ryo's voice was low, almost a murmur, yet it cut through the silence like a razor. He was displeased. I didn't need to understand the nuances of their business to see it in the rigid line of his shoulders, the absolute lack of emotion in his dark, obsidian eyes. Then, those eyes flicked to me. It was like being pinned by an entomologist. I froze for a fraction of a second, my training screaming at me to remain impassive, invisible. He had never looked at me before. Not once in the 6 months I had worked here. I was furniture. "You," he said, the single English word a stark command. The entire table turned to look at me. My invisibility cloak had just been ripped away. He switched to Japanese, his tone smooth and deceptively polite. It was a rapid, formal cascade of words, a test I could feel in my bones. He was speaking about wine, about a specific vintage he desired from the cellar, something rare and obscure. He was doing it to further humiliate Endo, to demonstrate that even his maid was subject to his impossible standards. He expected me to stammer, to bow and fetch the translator, to fail. He was using me as a weapon against his own man. I held his gaze. I felt the weight of every man's stare, the oppressive judgment. I took a breath. And then I replied. In perfect, formal Japanese, I said, "The 1982 Chateau Margaux. An excellent choice, sir. It will need a moment to breathe. Will that be acceptable?" The silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of tension, but of pure, unadulterated shock. Endo's jaw was slack. The other men stared, their masks of bored indifference slipping. Ryo's expression did not change, but I saw a flicker, a micro-expression of surprise in his eyes before it was extinguished. I wasn't finished. I turned to his guest on the right, a stern-looking man from Shanghai, and switched to flawless Mandarin. "Sir, would you perhaps prefer a baijiu to accompany the final course? We have a fine collection." The man blinked, then gave a slow, appreciative nod. I then glanced at the French arms dealer sitting to Ryo's left. "In perfect Parisian French?" I asked. "And for you, sir? Perhaps the dessert wine is too sweet? I could recommend a cognac." He let out a low whistle of admiration. I gave a quick, quiet instruction in Spanish to one of the younger staff members hovering by the door, telling him which glasses to bring. Finally, I turned my attention back to the man at the head of the table. Back to English. My voice was steady, betraying none of the adrenaline thundering through my veins. "The 1982 Chateau Margaux. I will retrieve it for you now, sir." I had not just answered his challenge. I had taken his power play and dismantled it piece by piece in front of his entire command. I had shown him I was more than a uniform. It was the most dangerous thing I had ever done. I gave a slight bow and turned to leave. "Stop." Ryo's voice cut through the air again. I stopped, my back to him. Everyone out. The scraping of chairs was immediate. His men filed out of the room without a word, a silent army, obeying its general. The door clicked shut, leaving just the two of us in the vast, silent space. The weight of his stare was a physical pressure on my back. "Turn around," he commanded. I did, slowly. I kept my hands clasped in front of me, my expression neutral. He was studying me, his head tilted slightly. He was reevaluating an asset. Or a threat. "What is your name?" he asked, his English precise. "Lena Jones, sir." "You are no longer a maid, Lena Jones," he said, the way he spoke my name sending an unwelcome shiver down my spine. It sounded different in his mouth. Sharper. "Your duties have changed. You will be my personal attendant. You will be where I am. You will see what I see. Your silence is no longer a professional courtesy. It is a condition of your continued existence. Is that understood?" There was no choice. There was never a choice in this house. This was not a job offer. It was a cage. I had flown too close to the sun, and now he had caught me, pulling me from the sky and locking me in a gilded prison at his side. "Yes, sir," I said. "Understood." That was the moment everything changed. My world, once defined by polished silver and quiet corridors, now belonged to him. The next morning, my maid's uniform was replaced by a severe, tailored black suit. It felt like armor, but it also felt like a target. I stood behind Rio's desk in his office, a silent shadow in a room of steel, glass, and shadows. The floor-to-ceiling window overlooked a meticulously raked Zen garden, a pocket of tranquility in the heart of chaotic Tokyo, and a stark contrast to the business being conducted within. I learned more about him in that first day than in my 6 months of cleaning his floors. He ran his empire with the precision of a surgeon. There was no shouting, no overt displays of aggression. Power here was expressed through chilling stillness. A single, quiet word from him could seal a man's fate. He caught a man lying about a shipment, not through evidence, but through the subtle tremor in the man's hand as he reached for a cup of tea. Rio didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Leave," and the man crumpled, his face ashen. I knew, with a certainty that chilled my blood, that the man would not see another sunrise. This world was lethal, and Rio was its center of gravity. Late in the afternoon, after dismissing his last appointment, he rose from his desk. "Come with me." He led me not to another meeting room, but through a series of stark corridors to a part of the mansion I had never seen. He slid open a heavy wooden door, revealing a small, enclosed garden. Unlike the public Zen garden, this one was lush, almost wild, centered around a single, weeping cherry blossom tree and a simple, unmarked stone. The air here was different. Softer. Sut. He walked to the stone and stood before it, his back to me. For a long time he said nothing. The silence was not the tense, weaponized silence of his office. It was heavy with grief. "This is for my sister," he said finally, his voice rougher than I'd ever heard it. Her name was Hannah. He turned to look at me, and for the first time, the mask was gone. In his eyes, I saw not a mafia boss, but a man hollowed out by loss. A wound that would never heal. She was killed. An attack by a rival family, the Hashimotos. It was meant for my father, but she was caught in it. He looked at the stone again, his jaw tight. I was supposed to be with her that day. I was 17. I chose to go to a training session instead. To make myself stronger for the family. A choice of duty over blood. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but the shame was a palpable thing, a toxic cloud around him. The honor I sought cost me my sister. He finally met my eyes again. She loved languages. She wanted to travel, to see the world beyond these walls. She would have been fluent in 10 languages by now. And then I understood. My display in the dining room hadn't just been an act of defiance. It had been an echo of someone he had lost. In his cold, calculated world, I was a ghost of a different kind. I was a reminder of the one person he had failed to protect. It was his one vulnerability, the crack in his perfect, obsidian facade. The moment was broken by the frantic sound of footsteps. One of his guards burst into the garden, bowing low. "Sir, there's a problem." At the main gate, Rio was transformed in an instant. The grieving brother vanished, and the clan leader returned. His face was cold stone. "What is it?"
A car.
Security flagged it. "There's a device underneath."
A bomb.
Chaos erupted. Alarms blared. Men in dark suits ran through the corridors, shouting into radios. Rio moved with a calm, deadly purpose, issuing orders. I was swept along in his wake, my heart pounding against my ribs. We were in the main foyer when a wave of force threw us forward. The sound was deafening, a roar that shook the very foundations of the building. The windows at the front of the mansion shattered, spraying glass like shrapnel. In the ensuing panic, I saw my chance. The side entrance was open, security forces focused on the front gate. I could run. I could disappear into the Tokyo night and never look back. It was the smart thing to do, the sane thing to do. But as I turned to go, I saw him. Rio was leaning against a pillar, his hand pressed to his side. A dark stain was spreading across the white silk of his shirt. A piece of flying glass had caught him. He was bleeding. He looked up, and his eyes found mine across the chaotic room. He saw the escape route I was staring at. He saw the choice in my face. His expression was unreadable, but I felt he was waiting to see if I would run. My feet felt rooted to the floor. I thought of his sister. I thought of the shame he carried like a shroud. I couldn't explain it, not even to myself, but I couldn't leave him like that. I walked toward him, tearing a strip of fabric from the hem of my expensive new skirt. I pushed his hand away from the wound and pressed the makeshift bandage against it, applying firm pressure. The world was exploding around us, but in that small space, there was only the feeling of his warm blood on my hands and the stunned look in his eyes. I had made my choice.
I had chosen to stay.
Later, the chaos subsided into a low hum of activity. The police had come and gone, their questions expertly deflected by Rio's lawyers. The bomb had been a message from the Hashimoto clan. An escalation. Rio's office was dark, save for a single desk lamp that cast long shadows across the room. I was cleaning his wound. The cut was deeper than I'd thought, a jagged line across his ribs. He had refused a doctor, trusting only me. He was shirtless, and the lamplight danced across the canvas of his skin. The dragon on his arm was part of a larger masterpiece, a tapestry of ink that told a story of power, pain, and tradition. My fingers, surprisingly steady, worked to disinfect the gash. The scent of antiseptic mingled with his cologne, a heady mix of cedarwood and smoke. We were so close I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, see the slight flare of his nostrils with every breath. The silence was intimate, charged. He reached up and grabbed my wrist, his grip firm but not painful. My hand stilled. I looked up from his wound and met his eyes. They were dark, searching. "Why didn't you run?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. I could have given 1,000 answers. That I was scared, that I didn't know where to go. But I chose the truth, or at least the simplest version of it. "You were bleeding," I said. It was all that needed to be said. He held my gaze for a moment longer, a silent conversation passing between us that I couldn't begin to decipher. Then he released my wrist, a silent permission to continue. As I finished bandaging his side, I knew a line had been crossed. He no longer saw me as just an employee or a reminder of his sister. He saw me as something else. And that was far more dangerous. The war with the Hashimoto clan bled into every corner of our lives. The mansion was no longer a fortress. It was a cage under siege. Every trip outside was a calculated risk, flanked by armored cars and men with eyes that never stopped scanning the crowds. My role shifted again. I was no longer just an attendant. I was a shadow, the one person whose presence he tolerated in the tense quiet before a storm. The storm broke on a rainy Tuesday night. We were at a private dinner at a restaurant in Ginza, a place Rio supposedly owned. The meeting was with a neutral party, an attempt to negotiate a truce. But it was a trap. The first shots shattered the serene ambience, turning the restaurant into a war zone. Rio reacted instantly. He didn't dive for cover. He moved toward the threat, pulling me down with him. He shoved me behind the overturned table, his body a solid, living shield over mine. The world dissolved into a cacophony of gunfire, shattering glass, and the screams of the innocent. All I could smell was gunpowder and his cologne. All I could feel was the solid weight of him, the rhythmic beat of his heart against my back. He was a creature of this violence, moving through it with a terrifying, practiced grace. I saw it happen in slow motion. A Hashimoto gunman, appearing from a side door, took aim at us. Rio was focused on two others in front. The gunman was going to shoot him in the back. He was going to shoot through me to get to him. Then, a searing pain ripped through Rio's shoulder. He grunted, his body lurching against mine. He'd twisted at the last second, taking a bullet that had been meant for my head. The sight of his blood, shed for me, ignited something cold and furious inside me. We were pushed back into the restaurant's kitchen, the sounds of the firefight raging outside the swinging doors. Rio leaned against a stainless steel counter, breathing heavily, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder while the other held his pistol, aimed at the door. One of the attackers burst through, a wild look in his eyes. He saw Rio, saw his injury, and grinned, sensing an easy kill. He lunged. Rio was already moving to intercept, but he was slowed by the wound. The attacker was going to get to him. My mind went blank. Primal instinct took over. To my left, a large pot of water sat boiling on a stove, forgotten in the chaos. Without a single thought, I grabbed the heavy pot, ignoring the searing heat on my hands. I pivoted and threw the entire contents into the face of the charging man. He screamed, a horrifying, inhuman sound as his skin blistered and peeled. He dropped his weapon, clawing at his face. The moment of distraction was all Rio needed. He moved with brutal efficiency, and the man fell silent. I stood there, panting, staring at my hands. They were red and shaking. I had just done that. I had deliberately maimed someone. I had crossed a line I could never, ever uncross. I was no longer an observer in his world. I was a participant. The ordinary woman who had served wine and polished silver was gone forever. Back in the sterile silence of a safe-house apartment, the adrenaline drained away, leaving only the hollow echo of what I had done. I sat on the edge of a bed, staring at my trembling hands. Rio stood across the room, watching me. His shoulder had been patched up, but his suit was ruined, stained with his blood and mine. He walked over and knelt in front of me. He gently took my chin in his hand, forcing me to look at him. His eyes weren't cold. They were dark and intense, burning with an emotion I couldn't name. "You have a capacity for survival I did not expect," he said, his voice low and raw. "You are not who I thought you were." He paused, his thumb brushing against my lower lip. "You are a complication." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far more potent. It was an admission that I had breached his defenses, that I had fundamentally altered the variables of his life. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me. The next day, the Hashimotos made their next move. It wasn't a bomb or an ambush. It was worse. They sent a picture to Rio's phone. It was of Sarah, a young woman who used to be a maid at the mansion with me. She was bound and gagged, a Hashimoto soldier holding a knife to her throat. The message was simple and clear. "We know who she is. We can touch anyone from her world. We are coming for her through you." The threat was no longer abstract. It had my friend's face. The war was no longer his. It was mine. The plan was a frontal assault. Rio intended to hit the Hashimoto compound with overwhelming force, a blunt instrument of revenge. His lieutenants gathered around a blueprint, planning entry points and kill zones. I stood by the window. Sarah's terrified face burned into my mind. Their plan was flawed. It was what the Hashimotos would expect. It was a strategy of brute force, not intelligence. "That won't work," I said, my voice cutting through their discussion. The room fell silent. Every man turned to stare at me, the woman who dared to question their boss. Rio looked at me, one eyebrow slightly raised. Explain. You're planning to go through the front, through their defenses. They'll be waiting for you, I said, walking to the table and pointing at the blueprint. But Sarah and I used to talk. Her cousin worked catering for the Hashimotos. She told me about the service corridors, the ones they use for big events. They're not on any official blueprints. They lead directly to the kitchens, right below the main residence. There's an entrance here. I pointed to a small, unmarked alley on the map. They won't have it guarded. They won't even be thinking about it. There was a moment of stunned silence. Rio studied the map, then studied me. I can guide you, I said, my voice firm. I'm the only one who knows the route. His jaw tightened. The thought of putting me in the middle of that firefight was clearly something he couldn't stomach.
No.
It's too dangerous. It's more dangerous to leave Sarah in there for one more minute, I countered, meeting his gaze without flinching. This is my friend. This is my fight now, too. You put me in this world, Rio. You don't get to sideline me when it gets personal. I had used his first name. I had never done that before. It hung in the air between us, a claim and a challenge. He saw the resolve in my eyes, the steel that had been forged in his own violent world. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Get her a weapon. The assault was a blur of controlled chaos. Dressed in black tactical gear, I moved through the dark, damp service corridors, Rio and his most trusted men behind me. The fear was a living thing in my throat, but my focus on Sarah was sharper. I guided them through the maze, my memory of Sarah's casual descriptions now a lifeline. We emerged into the kitchen, just as I'd predicted. The element of surprise was total. But in the ensuing firefight, we were separated. I pushed forward, searching for Sarah, while Rio and his men engaged the main Hashimoto force. I found her in a storage pantry, tied to a chair. As I was cutting her free, the door swung open. It was Hashimoto himself, a cruel smile on his face. He grabbed me, pulling me in front of him as a shield, a cold blade pressing against my throat. Rio appeared in the doorway moments later, his face a mask of cold fury as he saw me. He froze, his gun aimed, but useless. Drop it, Tanaka, Hashimoto snarled. Or your pet dies. My mind was racing. Rio would die before he let Hashimoto use me against him. I had to do something. I knew from my research, from the files I had read in Rio's office, that Hashimoto had spent time in a Russian prison. It was a long shot. I began to speak, my voice low and urgent in Russian. A language I knew Rio didn't understand. He has a sniper on you. I lied, my voice steady despite the blade at my throat. But there's an escape hatch behind that shelf. Let my friend go, and I'll show you. You can still get out. Hashimoto's eyes widened in shock. He understood me. For one critical second, his focus shifted, his grip on me loosened as he glanced toward the shelf. It was the only opening Rio needed. He moved in a blur, not with a gunshot but with a precise, disabling strike. Hashimoto crumpled, the knife clattering to the floor. The war was over. Won not just by Rio's violence, but by my words. In the aftermath, back in the quiet sanctuary of his office, the world outside fell away. Sarah was safe. The Hashimoto clan was broken. It was over. Rio stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. I stood by the desk, the adrenaline finally leaving my system, leaving me exhausted and hollow. He turned to face me. The silence stretched, thick with everything unsaid. You saved us, he said, his voice quiet. Not with a weapon. With your mind. I brought you into this world, Lena. But you survived it on your own terms. He walked toward me, stopping just inches away. He said my name again, and the way it rolled off his tongue was a physical touch, a brand. My sister would have admired you. He looked down at a faint scar on his own hand. I have spent my life paying for a debt that can never be settled.
What I owe you now
is a choice. He laid a folder on the polished desk. Inside was a passport with a new name, a plane ticket to anywhere in the world, and bank details that would ensure I would never have to work again. My old life was gone, burned away in the fire of his world. This was the cost of my survival. And the cost for him? He was offering me something he never offered anyone: freedom. He was ceding control. "You can leave," he said, his voice flat, betraying nothing. "No one will ever follow you. You can be free of this." I picked up the ticket. The paper felt flimsy, insignificant. I looked at it, then I looked at him. Ryo Tanaka. The most dangerous man I had ever known. A man of violence and silence and absolute control. He was also the only person who had ever seen the entirety of me, my mind, my fear, my capacity for darkness, and not just accepted it, but valued it.
He saw me.
Slowly, deliberately, I placed the ticket back on the desk. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I just met his dark, waiting eyes. My choice was made. The silence that settled between us was not empty. It was a foundation, solid and unbreakable, built in the heart of a violent world. And we were standing on it, together.